Picture this, it's May 1940. Europe is on its knees. Nazi Germany's war machine is tearing across the continent with terrifying speed, and in Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt knows the United States needs to get ready for a fight it desperately wants to avoid. So he goes before Congress and makes a stunning declaration. He says that America must become what he calls the arsenal of, and to do that, he sets a goal so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that it sounds like pure fantasy. He wants American factories to produce 50,000 military aircraft every single year. Now, when that number reached the highest levels of the Nazi command, one man in particular found it absolutely hilarious. That man was Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal of the German Luftwaffe. Göring was a proud, arrogant man, a veteran fighter pilot from the First War who was utterly convinced of German industrial and military. He listened to reports of Roosevelt's speech and he scoffed. He dismissed it as pure propaganda, a desperate bluff from a nation he saw as soft, inexperienced, and completely unserious. In his mind, America was a land of car factories and consumer comforts. What did they know about the brutal, disciplined business of war production? The very idea that those automobile plants, churning out cars and refrigerators, could be converted to build sophisticated fighting machines was, to him, a joke. He saw American industry as lacking the technical skill, the raw materials, and most importantly, the sheer will to accomplish such. This miscalculation, this arrogant dismissal of American potential, would become one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures of the entire war. Because what Göring and the Nazi high command failed to understand was that they weren't just betting against a president's speech. They were betting against the entire American industrial base, its capacity for innovation, and the sheer will of its people. And as we're about to see, that was a truly terrible bet to make. This sets the stage for one of the most incredible turnarounds in history, a story of production that would completely reshape the war and leave those Nazi leaders. While Göring was laughing in his Berlin headquarters, a quiet revolution was already underway in Washington, D.C. The man President Roosevelt turned to was not a general or a politician. He was a businessman and arguably the best production genius in the entire world. His name was William S. Knudsen, and just a few months earlier, he had been the president of General Motors. This was the secret weapon Göring never saw coming. Knudsen was a living legend in industrial circles. He was a Danish immigrant who started out as a machinist and worked his way to the very top of the biggest corporation on Earth. He didn't just understand mass production. He had helped invent and perfect it alongside figures like Henry Ford. His entire career was about doing one thing, figuring out how to make more things, faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. And he was so committed to the cause that he took the job for a salary of $1 a year. Knudsen's first move was absolutely critical. He didn't try to build massive, government-owned factories from scratch. Instead, he went on a cross-country tour, visiting the titans of American industry, the heads of Ford, Chrysler, General Electric, and hundreds of smaller companies. His pitch was simple: we have a job to do, and you already have the tools and the talent to do it. He convinced automakers to build plane engines. He got a refrigerator company to make propellers. A furniture factory started producing troop gliders. He was adapting the principles of the automotive assembly line with its standardized parts and efficient workflow to the incredibly complex task of building airplanes. It was a monumental. Before Knudsen, airplanes were almost handcrafted by skilled artisans in aviation-specific plants. After Knudsen, they were broken down into thousands of individual components that could be built by separate factories all over the country and then assembled like a model kit in massive new facilities. This decentralized system was not only incredibly efficient, it was also bomb-proof. You couldn't knock out American aircraft production with a single air raid because it was everywhere. Göring was looking at America's past, but Knudsen was building its future, and he was building it on a scale that defied imagination. But even Knudsen's brilliant system needed a place to come together, a factory so vast it was unlike anything ever built on Earth. And that is exactly what happened next. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly to the outside world, but the numbers soon started to tell a story that must have seemed unbelievable to anyone who had seen the anemic production lines of just a few years before. The momentum built month after month, a snowball rolling downhill, gathering mass and speed at an astonishing rate. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, officially dragging the United States into the global conflict, the American industrial giant was already awakening. Factories that had been retooling and retraining were now hitting their stride. The monthly output, now that might not sound like a lot compared to the ultimate goal, but consider this, it was a 20-fold increase from the production levels of just 2 years prior. They had already multiplied their output by 20 times before a single American soldier had fired a shot in anger. This was the foundation, the proof that Knudsen's plan was not just theory, but a roaring success. And that was just the beginning. Once the entire nation was united in the war effort after Pearl Harbor, the production curve the progress was exponential. They blew past Roosevelt's seemingly impossible goal of 50,000 planes a year long before the war was over. At the absolute peak of production, American factories were not making 50,000 aircraft annually. They were producing nearly 100,000. That's right, imagine the sight of it, a new warplane rolling out of a factory, on average, every 5 minutes of every single day, day and night, week after week. This wasn't just meeting a quota, it was shattering every expectation and rewriting the rules of what was industrially possible. The sheer volume of aircraft became a physical weapon in itself, drowning the Axis powers in a tidal wave of American aluminum and steel. But this incredible output wasn't just about the number of airframes. The real story of superiority was happening inside each one of those planes, in the technology and the firepower that would give Allied pilots. Now you might be asking, how could the Nazi leadership be so blind? How could they ignore such a monumental shift happening right in front of them? The truth is, they had all the information they needed. They had a military attaché in Washington, General Friedrich von Bottcher, who was sending back remarkably accurate and detailed reports. He was warning Berlin about the sheer scale of the American industrial effort, the endless flow of resources, and the serious intent behind. But Hitler, Göring, and their inner circle didn't just dismiss these reports, they actively rejected them. Why? Because the information didn't fit their deeply held, racist worldview. Their judgment was completely clouded by a toxic cocktail of racial prejudice and ideological arrogance. In their twisted Nazi ideology, Americans were a degenerate, mixed-race people, a weak democracy paralyzed by internal debate, and they saw a consumer society obsessed with comfort and luxury, and they interpreted that as a fundamental weakness. They believed that only a pure, disciplined, authoritarian state like theirs, led by a single will, could muster the spiritual and industrial strength for total war. The very things that made America powerful, its diversity, its free market ingenuity, its decentralized democracy, were seen by the Nazis as fatal flaws. They were convinced that at the first sign of real hardship, American society would fracture and collapse. This wasn't a simple intelligence failure, it was a total failure of imagination, fueled. They chose their own bigoted beliefs over the facts laid out by their own experienced officer. This arrogant dismissal meant they made no serious contingency plans for the kind of overwhelming production they would eventually face. They were preparing for the war they wanted to fight, not the war they were actually going to get. And while they were smugly confident in their own superiority, the Americans were solving one of the biggest bottlenecks in weapons production in the most American way possible, by building the biggest factory the world. And nothing symbolized this monumental effort more than a single, colossal factory that rose from the farmland of Michigan. This was the Willow Run plant, built by the Ford Motor Company, and it was the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world. It was a monument to American ambition, a physical statement of intent that stretched over a mile long. Its sole purpose was to build one of the most complex airplanes of the war, the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. This was the ultimate test of taking automotive mass production and applying it to something with over 300,000 parts. But the project almost failed catastrophically. The engineers and managers refused to give up. They implemented ruthless new quality control systems, stationing inspectors at every point on the massive line. They trained and retrained the workforce until the processes became second nature. They learned from their mistakes with a determination that only a free and motivated people could muster. And then the tide turned. The factory found its rhythm. By the peak of production in 1944, Willow Run achieved something that must have seemed like they were producing one fully assembled, four-engine B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. One complete warplane every single hour around the clock. But the most stunning fact, the one that would have horrified the Nazi high command, is this: at its peak, this single American factory, Willow Run, was producing more total military aircraft than the entire aviation industry of Nazi Germany. Not more bombers, more planes in total. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of concept, a concrete rebuttal to every arrogant assumption the Nazis had made. Yet this incredible output of aircraft was only possible because of another, quieter revolution happening on the factory floor, a transformation in the American workforce that the Nazis would have considered. Now, to build all those planes at Willow Run and thousands of other factories, you needed an army of workers. And this is where the Nazis made another catastrophic miscalculation. They believed that when American men were drafted into the military, the industrial workforce would collapse. They were wrong again, because while the men were fighting, a new force was reporting for duty on the home front. This was the army of women entered the industrial workforce in numbers that were absolutely unprecedented in history. By 1943, a staggering 65% of the workforce in the aircraft industry were women. They were operating massive machine tools, reading complex blueprints, and handling intricate electrical wiring. And when German intelligence picked up on this, they saw it as a sign of desperation and weakness. In their rigid, patriarchal worldview, a nation relying on women to build weapons was a nation on the brink of collapse. But these women weren't just filling in, they were excelling. Managers and engineers were often astonished to find that the new female workers frequently had a better touch for the delicate, precise work required in aircraft assembly. Their attention to detail improved quality control. Their smaller hands were sometimes better for intricate tasks. They weren't a liability, they were a massive upgrade to the workforce. This transformation was something the Nazi ideology could never Their system kept women largely in the home, denying their nation access to a huge pool of talent and capability. America's ability to mobilize its entire population, regardless of gender, was a stunning demonstration of democratic flexibility and strength. It was a testament to the spirit of a country where people were willing to do whatever it took to get the job done. This collective effort, this shared sense of purpose, is what truly powered the arsenal of democracy. But building the planes was only half the battle. They then had to get this overwhelming force across an ocean and into the fight, which presented a logistical challenge on a scale. As the relentless wave of American production began to crest, the German High Command finally realized the scale of the threat they were facing. But instead of innovation, they responded with desperation, retreating into a strategy that perfectly reflected the brutal and inefficient nature of their regime. This was the Jaeger program, a last-ditch effort to hide their manufacturing from the Allied bombers that were now regularly striking deep into Germany. They made the fateful decision to break up their production lines and scatter them into a network of 729 underground facilities, in caves, in mines, in tunnels hidden beneath forests. It was a logistical nightmare that destroyed any hope of efficient, large. But the true failure, the element that made the whole effort counterproductive, was the workforce. With their own men gone to the front, the Nazis turned to slave labor on a massive and horrific scale, forcing millions of prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates to work in these miserable conditions. The result was exactly what you would expect from a terrified, starving, and oppressed workforce that had every reason to want the Nazi regime to fail. Sabotage became a silent weapon. Workers might deliberately misalign a crucial component, use the wrong material, or leave a critical fastener untightened. The defect rate soared. There are reports of engines failing after just a few hours of operation because of sand deliberately poured into the oil systems. They were essentially producing more faulty equipment than usable weapons. This was the ultimate contrast in systems. America's open, free, and motivated factories were achieving miracles of efficiency. Germany's hidden, slave labor camps were producing chaos and failure. The Nazi war machine, for all its early blitzkrieg glory, was being strangled by the very nature of its oppressive ideology. They couldn't inspire their workers, they could only terrorize them, and that approach proved to be a catastrophic strategic failure. While their production faltered, the full weight of America's output was being delivered to the front lines, where it would meet the Luftwaffe in a battle of attrition they could never hope to win. So what was the result of all this effort? What did this tidal wave of American production actually mean for the pilots flying over Europe and the soldiers fighting on the ground? It meant absolute, undisputed dominance of the sky. By 1944, the sheer weight of numbers became the Allies' greatest weapon. That single year of American production, which saw nearly 100,000 aircraft roll out of factories, actually exceeded the total number of planes Germany had managed to build during the entire war. This imbalance decided battles before they were. The most stunning example was on D-Day, as the greatest amphibious invasion in history launched onto the beaches of Normandy. The sky above belonged almost entirely to the Allies. Historians estimate the Allies enjoyed a 36-to-1 advantage in aircraft over the Luftwaffe that day. 36 Allied planes for every one German plane. Imagine being a German soldier on that day, looking up at a sky that was never empty, only ever filled with the shapes of enemy bombers and fighters. There was no respite, no moment. This overwhelming air superiority was the direct product of American industrial might. It meant that every single German tank, truck, or train moving toward the front was in constant danger of being spotted and destroyed from the air. It meant that Allied ground troops had their own personal air force overhead, ready to provide close support. But most importantly, it meant that the Luftwaffe was bled white. Every time a German pilot took off, he was engagement dozens of enemy aircraft. And even if he was an ace, even if he shot down one or two planes, he would eventually. And when his plane was lost, it was a loss the German industry could no longer replace. Their production was shattered, their pilots were exhausted, and their fuel was running out. The industrial miracle happening back in America had created a battlefield reality where German losses were permanent, while Allied losses were quickly made good by the endless stream of new planes and fresh pilots. This crushing material advantage broke the back of the Luftwaffe and paved the way for victory in Europe. And as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the man who started it all by laughing at the very idea of this production was finally forced to confront the terrifying reality. So what became of Hermann Göring, the man who had laughed at the very idea of American production? His story ends not on a battlefield, but in a quiet interrogation room, where the full, humiliating truth was finally laid bare before him. After his capture by Allied troops, he was initially defiant, still clinging to his arrogance. But as he was interrogated, and as the sheer, undeniable evidence of the Allied war machine was presented to him, that arrogance began to crack. He was held by officers who had witnessed the production miracle firsthand, and they walked him through the numbers, the tonnage of bombs, the endless fleets of ships and planes. And slowly, reluctantly, the man who had once dismissed it all as propaganda was forced to concede. He expressed a kind of astonished disbelief at the scale of the American logistical operation, the ability to not just build this incredible amount of material, but to transport it across an ocean and deliver it to the front lines. His famous admission to his interrogators was a masterpiece of understated horror. He said, "I knew American industrial potential was great, but the execution exceeded my worst fears." Think about the weight of that statement coming from him. It was the ultimate admission of defeat. His worst fears, the nightmare scenario he had dismissed as impossible, had not only come true, but had been surpassed in every way. The bluff he thought he was calling was the cold, hard reality of a nation fully mobilized, a reality that had crushed his air force, his army, and his ideology. This was the final, bitter lesson for the Reich Marshal, learned far too late in a prison cell. His journey from arrogant dismissal to horrified realization closes the loop on one of the greatest miscalculations in military history. But his personal story is just a footnote in the much larger, enduring legacy of the effort that proved him so catastrophic. When we look back at the full scope of this achievement, the numbers are still almost impossible to grasp. In 1940, American factories produced just 3,600 military aircraft. By the time the war ended, that number had exploded to nearly 300,000. This was not a marginal increase, it was a complete metamorphosis of an entire nation's industrial capacity. But the legacy of this production miracle is about so much more than just the mind-boggling statistics. It was, without any doubt, the single most decisive factor in securing Allied victory. It provided the tools that ended the war, ensuring that every soldier, sailor, and airman had the equipment needed to win. But its impact echoes far beyond 1945. This effort launched the American century, catapulting the United States into its role as the world's preeminent economic. The technologies and methods perfected under that immense pressure, from radar to advanced manufacturing, fueled an unprecedented era of innovation and prosperity. Most importantly, it delivered a powerful and enduring lesson to the world. It proved, beyond any argument, the superiority of a free society over a totalitarian one. It demonstrated that free labor, motivated by a common cause and a shared belief in liberty, is infinitely more effective and innovative. It showed that a democracy could mobilize for total war with a speed and efficiency that no dictator could ever hope to match. The arrogant assumptions of men like Göring were not just wrong, they were completely inverted. The very things they dismissed as weaknesses, our diversity, our freedom, our consumer economy, became our greatest strengths. The story that began with a dismissive laugh in a Berlin headquarters ended with the relentless, thunderous hum of assembly lines that built a brighter future, proving that when free people